everyone. In the next couple videos, we're going to be going over the American Civil War. In these videos, we're going to be discussing the battles, the key strategies, the advantages and disadvantages, the people, everything that has to do with the American Civil War, and we might even get a little bit about the actual results of the war before we go into Reconstruction. On the surface, it would appear somewhat obvious that the North would win the Civil War. They had a higher population, most of the manufacturing in the country, and the vast majority of the railroads, which would all play a role in the Union victory, but the Civil War still would last for 4 years. The South did have some key advantages that helped them prolong the war. So let's go ahead and look in depth at how the South was able to prolong the war by examining their advantages. First, the South just needed the North to recognize the Confederate States of America as an independent nation. Essentially, the South did not need to outright defeat the North. They just needed the North to get tired of fighting. The longer the war lasted, the more likely the South was to win independence. The thought here is that eventually the Northern public would tire of the cost in both lives and money to wage a war to force the Southern states to stay in the Union, and would therefore pressure their leaders to negotiate peace. In contrast, the North had to invade the South and force the South to surrender. Next was geography. The South, to use a phrase from the world of sports, had home field advantage. The Confederacy was defending their own land as the vast majority of the fighting took place in the seceding states. As a result, Southern troops would be more familiar with the terrain and also likely to have the support from the local people. Finally, and this was very key for the first few years of the war, the Confederacy had significantly better military leadership. First, Confederate President Jefferson Davis had actually served in the United States military as an officer prior to entering into politics. Furthermore, the main Southern Army, the Army of Northern Virginia, was led by General Robert E. Lee. Lee was a brilliant tactician whose leadership pushed the Union Army to the brink. Lee had actually been offered leadership of the Union armies by Abraham Lincoln, and Lee actually opposed secession. However, once Virginia chose to secede, Lee decided his loyalty to the state was stronger than that to his country. The South's other generals proved to be quite skilled as well, such as P.T. Beauregard, Jeb Stuart, and Stonewall Jackson. In contrast, the North's military leadership was exceptionally weak at the start of the war. Abraham Lincoln had no military experience and very limited government experience going into the war. However, he quickly made himself a student of war and proved to be an exceptional military leader. For the Army, Lincoln appointed General Winfield Scott to lead the Union armies. Scott was a hero of both the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War, and was one of the few who realized that the war would be long. Although Scott did ultimately play a very key role in helping the North eventually win the war, he was quite old by the time the war broke out and retired shortly into the war. Replacing Scott was General George McClellan, who proved to be a very weak leader as the early battles proved. And although the Union had many advantages, two proved to be overwhelming in the long run. The first was population. The Union population was nearly double that of the Confederacy, at 23 million to 9 million, and when put into consideration the number of slaves who were initially not permitted to join the Confederate armies, the Northern population advantage grew even more. The size of the Confederate armies peaked at 480,000 at the beginning of 1864, whereas at its largest, the Union Army totaled 959,000 in 1865. The Union held close to a 2-to-1 advantage throughout the war. In order to maintain the size of the armies, both sides utilized conscription. Conscription is forced military service. The South was first used conscription. By April of 1862, all white men in the South between the ages of 18 and 35 were required to serve 3 years in the Army. The Union also began drafting soldiers in March of 1863, requiring those between the ages of 18 and 40 to sign up. The ability to quickly move troops and supplies around via railroads proved to be a significant advantage for the North. When the war broke out, there were nearly 30,000 miles of railroad in the United States. Of that, 21,000 miles were laid in the North. Railroads were beneficial for the South as well. The Confederate victory at the First Battle of Bull Run on July 21, 1861, was possible due to the addition of 2,500 more troops by train to the battlefield. The North, however, gained the greatest advantage by being able to resupply their armies with men and supplies as the war dragged on and moved deeper into the South.
There were three potential strategies that the South could have used to defeat the Union. First, they could simply defend their borders. This option wasn't really possible because the South needed to export goods and import necessities, so they could not close off their borders. Second, they could attempt to pull the Northern troops further into the South and thus isolating them from Northern supply routes. While potentially the strategy offered the best chance of success, it was an unpopular strategy. The most northern of the Confederate states would essentially be taken over by Union troops as the Confederate forces pulled deeper and deeper into Southern territory. And those Confederate states were not willing to give up territory even for the benefit of the Confederate states. Finally, the third strategy was known as offensive defensive. The South would attack Northern troops in some areas and withdraw troops in others in order to draw Northern forces south. Essentially, the South would fight mostly a defensive war. This is the strategy that the South ended up utilizing. Southern General Robert E. Lee utilized the strategy predominantly. He pushed his troops into Northern territory, and this was beneficial in part because it allowed his troops to live off of Northern resources. Lee's army fought two major battles in Northern territory. The first was the 1862 Battle of Antietam in Maryland. The Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest single-day battle in the Civil War. The battle is considered a Union victory, though it was really a stalemate. The North claimed victory because for the first time they did not outright lose a battle, and also Lee did withdraw his troops from the battlefield. This could have been a true victory for the Union, but General George C. McClellan, the leader of the Union forces, failed to press his advantage and pursue Lee, and thus ignored an order from President Abraham Lincoln. In July of 1863, Lee's army reached the furthest point north it would ever go whenever it arrived in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle in the Civil War, with approximately 20,000 casualties on both sides, so about 50,000 total casualties. The battle took place over 3 days. On the third day of the battle, General Lee ordered General Pickett to lead the Confederate forces on a march across an open field to attack the main Union lines. The advance, known as Pickett's Charge, was a monumental failure and resulted in the deaths of numerous Southern troops. Lee was forced to retreat from the battlefield. The Battle of Gettysburg was one of the turning points of the war, as the South was forced into fighting a solely defensive war and faced being outmanned and outsupplied by the Union. The initial strategy used by the North was developed by General Winfield Scott. His plan, known as the Anaconda Plan, was a naval blockade of the Confederacy. The Confederate coastline stretched 3,000 miles from Virginia to Texas. The Union actually maintained the vast majority of the U.S. Navy at the outbreak of the war and was able to successfully blockade southern ports. After blockading Confederate access to the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, the next part of the plan involved taking over the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two, and taking a major supply and transportation route. It was known as the Anaconda Plan because, like the snake, the North would wrap its forces around the South and squeeze it until it could no longer resist. And as the war went on, the Anaconda Plan proved to be a great success. Although the plan spread the U.S. Navy out, it crippled the Southern economy. The Southern economy depended on exporting their plantation goods, and the blockade eliminated most Southern trade. Additionally, it eliminated a means of transporting troops and supplies and eventually completely cut off the Western Confederacy from the eastern half of the Confederacy. As far as army strategy, the Union began the war by attempting to push south into Virginia. However, they were monumentally unsuccessful. The Union Army was continually beaten and pushed back in the east by Confederate General Robert E. Lee's troops. Union success was so limited that the 1862 Battle of Antietam, which was a draw, was played up as a victory for the North simply because they did not lose. So clearly, a new strategy was needed. The North shifted its focus from the eastern front of Virginia to the western front. In the east, the Union would hold steady and prevent Lee from advancing into the north or on Washington, D.C. Resources would be pushed more to the western campaign to take the Mississippi River. There, Union General Ulysses S. Grant had proven to be quite successful. On July 4, 1863, the day after the Union victory at Gettysburg, Grant's forces successfully took the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Vicksburg was the final Confederate stronghold along the Mississippi River, and by taking the city, Grant completed the implementation of the Anaconda Plan. The Union held the Mississippi River and had completely cut off the Western Confederacy from the Eastern Confederacy. Grant went on to utilize the strategy of total war quite successfully and ruthlessly. At the end of 1863 and into 1864, Grant and fellow General William Tecumseh Sherman progressively moved the Western Union Army across the Deep South and into Tennessee and Georgia. Following the 1863 battles of Chickamauga and Chattanooga, Federal troops raided Southern towns and farms, destroyed property, supply lines, and tore up railroad lines in order to isolate Southern troops and hamper the war effort. As a result of Grant's successes, Lincoln appointed Grant as the head of all the Union forces in 1864. Grant moved east to take over the forces there, while General William T. Sherman took command of the Western forces. In the spring of 1864, Grant launched a continuous attack against Lee's forces. In the summer of 1864, Grant and Lee engaged in trench warfare around Petersburg, just south of the Confederate capital, Richmond, Virginia. The non-stop fighting in the summer of 1864 resulted in massive casualties. The Army of the Potomac, the Union's main army in the East, alone had 65,000 casualties. In comparison, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia did not even have 65,000 men. The Union had so many casualties because Grant was focused on victory at all cost. He knew he had a massive numerical advantage, and he used it. Although his strategy was successful, it was at the expense of the men in his army. The total war policy was best exemplified by General Sherman's march through Georgia, or also known as March to the Sea. After taking the city of Atlanta and burning it to the ground, Sherman marched his troops across Georgia to the port city of Savannah. Along the way, Sherman's men destroyed everything in their path. During the march, Sherman's armies attracted a large number of refugees, slaves who had fled and began following Sherman's troops. In order to address the problem of having thousands of refugees attached to his army, Sherman issued Special Orders No. 15, dividing land that had been taken in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida up to the former slaves in the area. This has popularly been referred to as 40 acres and a mule. The orders were later revoked in 1865 by President Andrew Johnson. Following the victories through Savannah, Sherman then marched his forces north towards Lee's army. On April 2nd, 1865, with the capital clearly about to fall into Union hands, Jefferson Davis and the rest of the Confederate government and forces fled the city of Richmond, Virginia. On April 9th, General Robert E. Lee surrendered his forces to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, essentially ending the war. And a mere 5 days later, on the evening of April 14th, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth.